phoneme extraction. Another critical tool we built into FacePoser was the phoneme editor. It processed the voice actors' dialogue lines and extracted phonemes to generate basic lip sync animations for our characters. For the hero characters, our animators use this as a starting point to create high-quality custom animations for each dialogue line, incorporating full facial animation. However, in a dynamic choreo scene, the animators wouldn't know exactly what the rest of the actor's body would be doing. This meant it required careful layering of choreo commands and timings in FacePoser, while still maintaining the actor's ability to dynamically respond to the player.
At the time of Half-Life 2's release, most first-person shooters gave the player a gun or a melee weapon right off the bat, but we opted to start them empty-handed. Without a weapon, it was easier to train the player on the more novel ways they're able to interact with the world and introduce them to our story. We wanted the player to transition from fugitive to the aggressor, and arming them at the right time created that moment naturally. By the time they finally get a weapon, they're done running away. They say sometimes the best way to win is to walk away, but we all know that's not true. The best way to win is to run towards something while shooting at it.
Dynamic mixing. During gameplay, many sounds are playing at the same time, but some are naturally more important than others, and we need to set the volumes of the sounds relative to each other to ensure that the important ones stand out. In a movie, this sound mixing is done as a post-process, but in a game, it happens real-time, responding to the player's actions, so we can't predict ahead of time which sounds will play simultaneously. To handle this, all the sounds are grouped into types and tagged with priorities. Then during gameplay, the audio system monitors all the active sounds and lowers the volume of sounds in a group if a higher priority sound is playing. And this mixing is adjustable. If the gunshots need to be loud in one scene, we can make them higher priority there. If a specific line of dialogue needs to be heard clearly, it can then force all the other sounds to drop in volume. And we do the same thing with music. It's a subtle but very critical system, and it just prevents the soundscape from becoming too cluttered. Bullet audio. If there's one thing we're sure of, it's that a lot of bullets will fly past a player throughout the game. So we spent a bunch of time trying to perfect the audio treatment for it. Unfortunately, bullets in the game are essentially instantaneous, so we can't just attach a sound to them and rely on the movement for positioning. So after some experimentation, we landed on this solution. By figuring out the closest point on the bullet's trajectory to the player's ear, we calculate the exact time and position the bullet would conceptually pass them. We then play two different sounds at that point to fake a Doppler effect, one for the bullet's approach and one for its departure. And we delay the departure sound based on the calculated time the bullet passed by.
Audio caching. Another problem we ran into was the sheer amount of audio in the game. With all the gameplay sounds, music, and dialogue, we had too much audio to be able to store it all in memory. Memory was at a premium in 2003. But as you can imagine, we need to be able to play sounds immediately, especially if they're gameplay related. So we built an audio cache, which stored only the first 125 milliseconds of every audio file and kept that in memory. That 125 millisecond time was our best guess for how long it would take us to be able to stream an audio file in from disk. Then, whenever a sound was played in-game, we'd play the start of it from our audio cache while simultaneously kicking off a load of the full audio file from disk. By the time our cache start ended, we'd have the file loaded and could continue playing the rest of the sound. There were some other minor features, like keeping recent sounds fully in memory so that high-traffic ones didn't need to be loaded constantly. In today's engines, all kinds of assets, beyond just sounds, typically use the same kind of strategy.
Physics sound. Getting physics to feel right for the player meant that the sounds produced by physics had to sound right too. As humans, we're all used to how objects and materials sound during various interactions, even if it's not something we actively notice. While we knew we couldn't account for everything, we wanted to focus on the details that contributed most to making our physics sound realistic. We started with per-object sounds for collisions and impacts. This allowed an object like a wooden crate to have custom sounds when it collided with other objects or classes of objects. Next, we began dynamically modifying these sounds based on the characteristics of the physical event, such as the masses involved and the force of the collision. This worked great for collisions, but didn't hold up in other interactions like objects scraping against each other. In reality, a wooden crate makes a different sound when it scrapes against a wall versus when it's thrown against that same wall. Let me tell you, nobody has done more research on the nuances of a wooden crate's physical properties than us. To get what we wanted out of these interactions, we implemented per-material collision sounds, metal against wood, metal against metal, and so on. These sounds were also dynamically modified based on details, like material hardness or type of metal. Getting this system to sound right required countless small tweaks, which we could only identify once it was running. We also experimented with custom sounds for rolling objects, but ultimately cut the feature because we weren't happy with the results.
Automating DSP. All the sounds the player hears are processed through our digital signal processing system, or DSP. And this just refers to how audio is altered to reflect the environment the player is in. For example, the same sound will differ when heard in a parking garage, a small room, outdoors. In Half-Life 1, we manually placed invisible nodes throughout the world to define these DSP settings for each space. For Half-Life 2, we knew that manual placement was just going to be way too time-consuming, especially since we wanted a larger game, and we still only had one audio person on the team. So we built a system that automatically determines the DSP settings around the player in real time. It does this by analyzing the space around the player, assessing the volume they're within. It examines the materials that make up the environment, basically. And then the system matches that space to one of the 25 hand-authored basic DSP types. We adjust some parameters, and we create the fully detailed DSP that modifies the sounds the player hears.
Metrocop scene. This is another scene designed to make it clear that the Metrocops are the bad guys, except this time the player has a weapon and can finally do something about it. That something comes out of the barrel of a gun. We knew we needed the player to feel righteous, and this moment was part of creating that. The Metrocops are still human, unlike the rest of the Combine in the game, so we felt like we had to go the extra mile in making sure the player's actions felt like justice and not just wrath.
Staircase. There are situations throughout the game that stem from simple and quite straightforward design goals, and this staircase features two of them. The first was to frame the Citadel as it awakened, showing the player they stirred up the hive. The second was to showcase our ragdoll system. While it's standard now, in 2004 it was still a novelty to see bodies tumble realistically, and stairs provided a perfect stage to make that happen.
City 17 awakens. The early train station section was designed to make the city feel indifferent toward the player, as if Gordon is just another nameless, faceless citizen, ripe for subjugation. But during the tenement raid and rooftop chase, the city identifies the player as an anomaly and starts to stir. Now, with the player as the aggressor, the city fully turns its attention on them. The Overwatch PA system, first heard during the raid, played a key role in delivering this message. If players listen closely, there's a lot of information about the city's awareness. Even when players didn't pay attention, though, the audio treatment still conveyed the emotional message we were aiming for.
Attention, protect.
Explosive barrels. Here, we introduce explosive barrels, a staple of first-person shooters, but with a new twist. The second pistol shot sets the barrel on fire, starting a timed detonation. A third shot will detonate the barrel immediately. This way, players could either delay the explosion or trigger it right away, depending on the situation. Players may want to feed an explosive barrel to a barnacle and then shoot it twice as a handy way to safely dispatch a cluster of them. The delayed explosion also made for more interesting chain reactions between multiple barrels. Exploding barrels were a fan favorite in the series, but also were internally favored by level designers who often felt like the game could never have enough
Lambda caches. Technically, the first Lambda cache is at Climber's lab, but this is the first one the player finds on their own. We added Lambda caches to encourage exploration and to hint players where hidden resources could be found, with a fiction being that they were being placed by the Resistance as part of their underground rebellion. In Half-Life, the contents of supply crates were predetermined by the level design. In Shell 2, we introduced adaptive item crates that give the player whatever they are low on at the time, based on resource targets set by the level designer.
Scanners. Scanners presented a tricky game design challenge. While we liked how their dystopian presence helped convey the Combine occupation as an oppressive surveillance state, we didn't actually want them to shoot at the player. We found that aiming into the sky to hit a small mobile enemy with a constant height advantage was something we couldn't make fun. Since we loved their role in the story, we decided that in combat, scanners would serve primarily as eyes, alerting nearby enemies to the player's presence, a feature we reinforced with sound effects from the soldiers. Beyond that, they'd only be able to harass the player with bright lights and occasionally dive bomb after taking enough damage.
Overwatch. During development, we generated the Overwatch voice using a free text-to-speech tool, but as we neared shipping, we realized we didn't actually have the rights to use it, so we held auditions with voice actors to find someone who could match the qualities we liked in the generated lines. Didn't take long before we found Ellen McLean, whose delivery was exactly what we were looking for. In her sessions, we played the generated lines for her to mimic, though in her own style. She was a bit sarcastic at first, given that she was being asked to replicate such a robotic delivery, but years later when she returned for her iconic role as GLaDOS in Portal, she'd found a way to creatively integrate that tone into her performance. Pistol design. The standard pistol is the workhorse of the game, functioning not only as the first range weapon you learn to use, but also as a method to interact with physics and destructible objects at a safe distance for the entirety of the game. To help make it feel more responsive and fun to use, the pistol employs a refire mechanic that's unique to it in the game. The gun will fire as fast as the player can click their input button, meaning that they feel an instant response to their input, and the faster they can click, the faster they can shoot.
Attention, protection.
Shatter glass. When designing early levels where there are fewer mechanics in the player's toolkit, we found that it's just as engaging to spotlight new technical features instead, as we did here with breakable glass. For the shattering effect, glass was divided into a grid of small squares, allowing us to track which were intact or broken, and to blow out larger sections once enough squares were no longer connected. Each square was rendered with a unique texture based on the status of its neighboring squares, creating the sharp, jagged edges between broken and intact glass. While breaking glass is now commonplace in games, it was something we hadn't seen much back when we were making Half-Life 2, and we're incredibly happy with the level of fidelity and dynamicism it brought to the game.
Helicopter Peekaboo. The Combine attack helicopter as central antagonist was something we wanted to develop throughout the entire chapter. The relentless chopper became a character in its own right. Here, if you listen and look overhead, you can hear its engine and see it flying along the train tracks and into the distance. This first glimpse is a small piece of foreshadowing, with its presence becoming more pronounced over time, until eventually you're squaring off against it.
Iterative passes. Some chapters of the game, such as the on-foot sections of the canals in Ravenholm, were developed in multiple passes by different cabals. We found that handing off maps in this way led to greater variety in the experience, and a higher density of interesting moments, as each cabal added their unique touches to the maps. In the on-foot portion of the canals, the first pass established the art direction and the player path, along with the broad strokes of the experience and some major beats. But the team-wide alpha playtest identified insufficient tension and a somewhat monotonous experience here. In our second pass, we returned to the map solely focused on creating that tension and greatly increased the density of moment-to-moment scenarios.
Water shader. The most complex shader we made for the game was the water shader, which made full use of the newly available programmable graphics cards. When water was present, the scene was rendered 3 times, times. First, the underwater world for refraction, second, a reflected view, and third, the parts above the water. When rendering the water surface, we blended the refractive and reflective views, showing more reflection at glancing angles using the Fresnel equation. We also tracked the ground depth below the water's surface, making it more transparent and less refractive in shallow areas. Additionally, we had to create 2 alternate water rendering techniques for lower-end graphics cards. Mid-range cards displayed a lower detail reflection without refraction or transparency, while low-end cards only rendered a partially transparent surface.
Interstitial scenes. As playtesting progressed, we often found areas where players lost track of their goal, which isn't uncommon in a game like Half-Life. To address this, we added smaller interstitial scenes to help guide players along their path and reinforce their objective. After finishing the bulk of development on our larger choreo scenes, like Kleiner's Lab, putting these smaller scenes together became relatively straightforward. We discovered that using characters in these moments worked much better than relying on passive storytelling, or even some sort of reminder you'd find baked into a pause menu.
Boxcar Bill. This small scene originally featured 2 human characters, but later in development, we replaced one with a Vortigaunt. We wanted to show that Vortigaunts were coexisting with humans and resisting the Combine as well. We also introduced their ability to heal the player, although we didn't fully capitalize on that feature throughout the game. Vortigaunts became a useful narrative tool for keeping dialogue brief, as their hive mind justified their full knowledge of the world and the player's goals. This meant they never had to ask questions, neatly sidestepping the challenge of writing dialogue for a silent protagonist.
Barnacle Introduction. Because barnacles can be confusing when first encountered, we wanted to introduce them in a way that showed players their behavior at a safe distance. We decided to do that through a nature show-style predator-prey scene. But, as always, scenes like this took a lot of iteration to get players to reliably see.
Surface properties. We play custom footstep sounds when the player walks on the slippery mud. This was a system called Surface Properties that used the material type to determine the sounds and other effects that should occur when walked on or shot at. Earlier in development, we had an effect that slowed players' movement when walking on mud surfaces. However, this was removed in the shipping version as it was decided it was too punishing.
Hey, over here! Mounted gun gallery. There are a few things going on in the scene. The turret firing at the breakable crates behind teaches players not to take the threat head-on and instead utilize the sewer routes to defeat it. And when they reach the turret, players enjoy using it in a shooting gallery with a wave of Combine soldiers and dive-bombing scanners. We also begin to introduce the missile-firing Combine APC that pushes the players along and will show up again later in the chapter.
Protection is coming down on underground stations. We're already getting refugees from 9 and outlying.
Station 8, do you copy? Station 8, are you there? We have they're filling the underground with Manhattan. Ground protection team. Alert. Code. Isolate. Expose. Alert. Community ground protection. Local unrest structure detected. Classified.
Over here! Keep going, friend. That station was raided, but there's others up ahead.
new area just to see enemies standing there is always awkward, and it makes the world feel less alive and more like a shooting gallery. So we were motivated to introduce enemies into combat spaces in more interesting and dynamic ways that would communicate planning and intentionality on their part. The soldiers had had a plan for Gordon even before he showed up. The Metrocops in this scene jumped down into this space via scripted sequences. Later in the game, we use rappelling in a similar way. It doesn't matter where they're coming from in reality because players end up telling that story to themselves. We found that in the end, combat should have a story implied in its setup. An ambush, a surprise, a surge, an assault. All of these scenarios use much of the same enemy AI, but all felt different to playtesters.
Barnacle bowling. This is a satisfying example of how a bunch of design elements can come together in a matrix of interactions to create a memorable scenario for the player. We got barnacles, our physics simulations, slippery mud surface properties, and last but not least, explosive barrels. You've encountered all of these on their own, but they're able to snap together naturally to create a moment we called barnacle bowling.
Physics in puzzles. Often, simpler mechanics encountered earlier in the game are pulled from more complex ones as a form of training. The teeter-totter puzzle, the first physics-based contraption in the game, was actually derived from a later, more intricate washing machine puzzle in the canals. The teeter-totter uses the same principles of mass and ramps, but in a more straightforward way that players can directly interact with, helping them understand the game's physics and making later puzzles easier to tackle. This puzzle also highlights the analog nature of the physics system, with the placement of cement blocks and the player's own weight both factoring into the solution.
Combine attack helicopter. Players have had glimpses before, but here's where we fully introduce the main boss of the Canals chapter, the Combine attack helicopter. This chopper relentlessly destroys a player's cover, forcing them to move forward or risk being gunned down. We wanted this sequence to feel tense and menacing, with the helicopter seeming far too powerful to confront directly, and maintaining that intensity through the canals until the final showdown in the reservoir. To achieve this, we heavily constrained the helicopter's movement based on specific gameplay goals. In this map, designed as a dash from cover to cover under helicopter fire, we created a ring path in the sky above the arena. The helicopter always travels to the farthest point in that ring for the player, keeping it visible and making it easier for us to place cover in just the right spots.
Normal maps. Half-Life 2 was developed during an exciting time for graphics, as the first programmable shader-supported graphics cards were hitting the market. Using this technology, we became one of the first games to implement normal maps, a technique that enhanced the lighting on surface geometry. The normal map described the surface's roughness, allowing each pixel of a polygon to be lit in a way that made surfaces appear bumpier and more detailed than ever possible in Half-Life 1.
Autosave dangerous. In Half-Life 1, we had a set of autosaves throughout the game, hand-placed by level designers and triggered when the player reached some specific moment or position in the game. This ensured that the game was automatically saved for you as you traversed through Black Mesa's corridors. In Half-Life 2, we found ourselves needing a new tool. The problem arose in some of the more complex arenas we'd built. Some of those encounters would last for quite a while and features multiple sets of enemies. Others were long, sprawling mixes of exploration and combat without any clear separation between the two. We never want an autosave where the player is in danger of dying right after loading the game, because that could place the player in a death loop. If you played enough games back then, you definitely found yourself in this situation at least once. So unless we deliberately crafted pauses in every arena's flow, there wasn't always a safe place to put an autosave. After some experimentation, we implemented a feature called Autosave Dangerous. This was a level designer tool that combined an autosave with an associated time frame. When triggered by the level designer, it immediately saved the game, but kept the save off to the side, not available as a save game to load from. If the player then stayed alive for the specified time frame, then the save would be committed and used as the most recent autosave. This allowed level designers to put an autosave at a reasonable place or time in an arena, specify a time, like 30 seconds, and if the player was still alive for 30 seconds, the autosave would be used.
Soundscapes. In Half-Life 1, ambient sounds were placed by hand and then individually tuned. For Half-Life In Half-Life 1, ambient sounds were placed by hand and then individually tuned. For Half-Life 2, we wanted more ambient sounds in our environment with higher quality and less manual effort for placement. So we built a system that we call the Soundscape system. A soundscape is basically a small program that controls which ambient sounds play, where they come from, and then how they behave in a specific environment. So flies buzzing, wind blowing, birds, a distant train, distant combat. The Soundscape system could then randomly select and play these sounds, and also, really importantly, handle the smooth transition as the player moves through environments. Soundscapes can also contain other soundscapes, and that allows us to create reusable collections of sounds. So, for instance, distant combat might be small arms fire, distant explosions, a passing helicopter. And these soundscapes would dynamically assemble and play from many individual sounds, and that helps us avoid the artificial feel of a single looping track. Overall, the sound...
Manhack Matt. We called this guy Manhack Matt. We wanted to give players the sense that hundreds of citizens inhabited the hidden nooks and crannies of City 17. At this point in the game, it had been a while since players had seen a citizen, and we wanted to explain the significance of the Manhacks, which was the first physics-based enemy that we created. In the original concept, there was a video arcade in the city where players could fly Manhacks around to attack virtual citizens. Eventually, players would discover that the Manhacks were real, and so were the citizens. As the Combine occupation became more fleshed out, this idea of a video arcade became an odd fit and eventually fell by the wayside.
Thanks for your help.
Explosive Barrel Factory. This room, filled with an absurd number of exploding barrels, inspired some good-natured debate within the team around how far to push the plausibility of our world. Frankly, one exploding barrel is probably too many in regards to realism. In the real world, barrels really shouldn't explode, even if you were to shoot them.
Rising water. The floating bridge and wooden spools here introduce the concept of buoyancy as a tool for the player. In this case, it's not really a puzzle, it's just some fun for the player interacting with the physics system. But later, we revisit this gameplay element in the canals to raise a ramp for the airboat.